Have you ever stopped to think about how many stories get buried every day beneath a disapproving look, a scornful expression, or a hasty conclusion based solely on appearance? Well, this one is going to leave you unsettled, and maybe more alert. The setting is a courtroom, supposedly the ultimate symbol of justice and impartiality. But in this case, what we saw was quite the opposite: a preconceived judgment, disguised as authority, aimed at a woman nobody there seemed willing to truly listen to. Or rather, almost nobody. Ashley walked into that room like so many other black women have before her, with quiet composure, simple clothes, and a calm demeanor, the kind that fools those who believe intelligence wears designer tags. For Judge Emily, one glance was enough to cast her verdict. Just another defendant trying to make excuses. What she didn't know was that Ashley had much more than excuses. She had experience, preparation, a mission, and most of all, a strategy. This story isn't about a one-time mistake. It's about a system that keeps failing because it refuses to look beyond the surface. It's also about courage, because it took a lot for Ashley to let herself be discredited on purpose. She wasn't there by accident. That hearing was part of a social experiment organized by an NGO fighting institutional racism. But of course, no one in that room knew that. What they saw was a young woman being interrupted, ridiculed, and ignored, until she started to speak. Not with anger, not with confrontation, but with arguments, with technical mastery, with jurisprudence at her fingertips. With each sentence, the room grew quieter. The judge, who hadn't even hidden her disdain, began adjusting her posture. Lawyers exchanged glances, and doubt spread like wildfire. Who is this woman? That's when one of the jurists stood up. With all due respect, Your Honor, this is Dr. Ashley Mendez, Professor of Constitutional Law and advisor to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Silence. Immediate. Heavy. Expressions changed. The air thickened. And Emily, the judge who began the day cloaked in superiority, now seemed small, because suddenly, Ashley wasn't just a young woman speaking eloquently. She was an authority, a specialist, a reference, and the discomfort was so great that the judge herself called for a recess, maybe to breathe, maybe to process how she had let prejudice dictate the pace of a hearing that should have been impartial. But here's the real point. This story isn't about exposing the judge. It's about exposing how sneaky prejudice is, how it hides in the details, in how someone is spoken to, where they're told to sit, who gets interrupted, and most dangerously, how present it still is precisely where justice is supposed to be blind, but keeps seeing with biased eyes. After the revelation, the hearing resumed, and Ashley, with the same calm she had entered with, ended her statement with a request that the judge reflect, that everyone there reflect, because she was not an exception, just one of many who don't have titles or spotlights to defend themselves. The difference? She had the chance, and chose to use it to make an impact, and she did. The video of the hearing leaked. It went viral. It became a national headline, a trending topic on social media, a debate in universities. The backlash was so intense that the National Council of Justice opened an investigation into discriminatory conduct in courtrooms. Judges were summoned for racial re-education workshops. Law schools across the country began discussing the case in classes on ethics and impartiality. In other words, it wasn't just a public embarrassment, it was a turning point. And perhaps the most beautiful part of this story is what came next. Because Ashley didn't stop there. She began touring the country giving lectures, visiting colleges, talking to law students from underprivileged backgrounds, sharing her experience as a warning, as inspiration, as a reminder that knowledge has no color, no wardrobe, no zip code, and that institutions, no matter how solid they seem, need and deserve to be questioned. Now take a deep breath and put yourself in her shoes. How would you feel if you were treated as less for something that doesn't define your worth? How many times have you been judged before getting the chance to speak? And more importantly, how many times have you judged someone based on looks, accent, posture? This story is uncomfortable because it mirrors us. It shows how we're still trapped by prepackaged ideas of who deserves respect and who should be dismissed. And beyond that, it challenges us. Because once you see, truly see, what happened in that courtroom, there's no unseeing it. You can't go back to before. Something changes. And maybe that's the noblest role of good stories. Not just to entertain, but to transform. So if this story moved you, don't let the feeling fade. Use it. question, talk, share. Because prejudice only survives in silence, and when we break that silence with truth, with example, with awareness, change begins. So I ask you now, what if it were you? The courtroom was silently still until Ashley walked in. Black, young, dressed plainly with a serene gaze. Judge Emily, cold and rigid as a stone, didn't even wait for the hearing to begin before forming her opinion. She looked her up and down with the arrogance of a verdict already written, and in doing so, unknowingly, began writing one of the most symbolic stories that courtroom would ever witness. Emily, so used to being feared, thought authority was imposed through tone and robes. She didn't listen, she interrupted, she mocked. With Ashley, it was no different. She insinuated she didn't understand the law. But what if I told you that Ashley's silence held back a storm of knowledge? The scene may have seemed ordinary, but it carried the weight of centuries of exclusion disguised as formality. These stories happen all the time, and the cruelest part, most go unseen, or people choose not to see. How many Ashleys have walked into courtrooms, schools, companies, and been judged by skin tone before they even speak? What seemed like just another hearing was about to become a masterclass, not for Ashley, but for those who dared to underestimate her. And if you think she was going to stay quiet, just wait to see what comes next. Ashley didn't raise her voice, didn't change her posture. She didn't need to. She simply opened her mouth with the calm of someone who knows the Constitution as well as their own name. Every sentence was a surgical strike against the prosecution's assumptions. She quoted articles, precedents, doctrines, with the ease of someone who'd taught it all dozens of times. People in the room began shifting in their seats. Lawyers exchanged glances. Interns typed furiously. The judge, once high and mighty, wasn't sure whether she should interrupt. Because now this wasn't just a young woman defending herself, it was an expert giving a public lecture. And these are the kinds of stories that prove real knowledge doesn't need to shout. It simply fills the room. If you think this is exaggerated, try remembering the last time you saw someone underestimated just because they didn't look the part. It happens to those with accents, without suits, arriving by bus. But Ashley wasn't an exception. She was the silent rule that finally decided to shout, with arguments. And what came next left everyone, including the judge, speechless. In that heavy, uncomfortable atmosphere, the truth exploded. A man stood in the back of the room, unable to stay quiet. "Excuse me, Your Honor. This is Ashley Montero, tenured professor of constitutional law, author of 3 books on racial justice." Silence. The kind you don't hear, but feel. The kind of moment that becomes a chapter in a book. Or better yet, one of those stories time can't erase. The judge froze. Her face tried to stay composed, but her eyes screamed, "What have I done?" Suddenly, everything shifted. This wasn't a hearing anymore. It was a mirror, and in it, Emily saw her own image, distorted by prejudice. Some whispered, others stared, but everyone in that room knew justice had just received a necessary and very public lesson. Ashley remained in the same place, same plain clothes, same calm gaze. But now, no one dared judge her by appearance again. Reality hit hard. She wasn't just a professor. She was a force of nature disguised in simplicity. And what they didn't know yet was that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Ashley took a deep breath, as if she had always known this moment would come. And then she revealed it was all part of a research project on institutional bias. She was there, undercover, to prove that race and appearance still shape how people are treated in courtrooms. The impact was instant. Everyone realized she wasn't just a defendant. She was a researcher, a strategist, a brilliant mind creating real-life stories to dismantle invisible structures. It wasn't sensationalism. It was method. Ashley brought data, cited studies, presented previous results. Her performance was part of a broader thesis, proving that justice is still selective. And that day, every move Emily made became evidence. Ashley's genius was in turning pain into argument, invisibility into revolution. And the most ironic part? She didn't even need to raise her voice. Some might say it was theater. But anyone who knows the backstage of inequality knows, when the door doesn't open, sometimes you have to kick it down. Ashley did it with elegance and strategy. She didn't seek attention. She sought change. And that courtroom, used to silencing people, was forced to listen. But the greatest twist was still to come, and it came from where no one expected. Emily tried to keep her face firm, but her body betrayed her. Her hands were sweaty, her breathing fast, and every phrase from Ashley felt like a mirror cracking her pristine image of authority. For the first time, she understood what it meant to be challenged by someone who didn't fit the mold. The most painful part? Knowing it was all being recorded, and that soon, it would become one of those stories that not even the silence of the system could hide. It wasn't just a technical mistake. It was a public humiliation, but not out of revenge. Ashley didn't point fingers, didn't provoke. She simply told the truth, a clear, sharp truth. Emily, even in silence, was stripped of her own prejudices before an entire nation. The case exploded on social media, in legal circles, and throughout the press. What began as contempt became headline news. At that moment, justice was being judged by those who should uphold it with neutrality, and the judge, who had long used her robe as a shield, now felt the weight of a mistake that went beyond ethics. It was human, but that, my friend, was just the beginning. Because institutional repercussions came next, and with force. Ashley had planted a seed, and the first signs of growth didn't take long. It didn't take long. The National Council of Justice issued a direct statement. An episode like that could not go unpunished. Emily received a formal warning and was enrolled, with no option to refuse, in a mandatory re-education program on racial bias, ethics, and empathy. For the first time, she would be the listener, not the authority. And just like that, another one of those forgotten stories became a reference point for transformation at the top of the system. That program, once seen as a mere formality, now held new weight. Judges from different states began to debate the case. Law schools introduced the hearing as a case study. Professors, students, and legal professionals started citing Ashley as a symbol of disruption. And the most remarkable part? The judiciary began to see itself in the mirror she held up. Committees were formed, events were organized, and even a proposal for an anti-discrimination protocol in courtrooms emerged. Ashley's name began circulating in high-level meetings, and what had once been dismissed as a misstep was now seen as moral jurisprudence. But don't think Judge Emily understood everything right away. Her real learning was still to come, in an unexpected and deeply symbolic setting. A week later, the lights came on in an auditorium packed with judges, prosecutors, and lawyers. It was the opening of a national seminar on racial equity in the judiciary. And, ironically, the keynote speaker was none other than Ashley Monteiro. In the shadows at the back of the room sat Emily, now just a listener, without robe, without podium. It was the beginning of one of those stories where the wheel turns powerfully. Ashley took the stage like someone stepping into familiar ground. She wasn't seeking revenge. She didn't use the microphone to attack, but to inspire reflection. She spoke with firmness, but also with empathy. She shared data, told real cases, recalled the courtroom moment. And with a disarming calm, she revealed how respect, in practice, still depends on the color of one's skin and social stereotype. Emily listened under the weight of realization. There was no audience to shield her authority, no protocol to protect her emotions. She now saw what she refused to see in that courtroom, and that discomfort she felt. It wasn't anger. It was awareness entering through the door of conscience. But the question lingering in the air was, what would she do with that? The answer came shortly after. At the end of the seminar, as the auditorium emptied, Emily slowly approached. She seemed smaller, lighter, but also more human. She stopped in front of Ashley, without robe, without arrogance. She looked her in the eye and said, "I was wrong. And not because I didn't know the law, but because I didn't know life." It was a short moment, but dense. The kind that doesn't need an audience to become one of those unforgettable stories. Ashley listened in silence and replied with a calm smile, unhurried. When justice listens, it learns. There was no hug, no tears. There was something greater, recognition. It was as if two versions of justice met, one old, rigid, cloaked in tradition, and the other young, clear-eyed, ready to evolve. In that moment, the reconciliation wasn't between people, it was between ideas. That simple gesture echoed far. It became news. It became an example. Institutions began debating not just the case, but what it symbolized. Brazil, so used to normalizing veiled prejudice, now saw a different path. But the real impact was still unfolding, and it would gain strength where the world's eyes were already watching. The video of the hearing went viral like few legal stories ever had. Within days, it reached millions of views, comments, and shares. But it wasn't the numbers that stood out. It was the reactions. Ordinary people moved to tears, legal professionals reflecting deeply, and young black viewers saying, "That woman represents me." The courtroom became a stage, and Ashley, a symbol of resistance and transformation. Law schools began including the case in their curricula. Newspapers ran headlines quoting her. Podcasts, YouTube channels, academic collectives all wanted to understand who Ashley was and what that hearing revealed about Brazil. More than a professor, she became a bridge between what the system is and what it should be. And each new mention fueled the movement. In the weeks that followed, a national campaign was born, led by her, for more humane, impartial, and conscious trials. Ashley traveled across the country, giving lectures, training teams, helping to redesign institutional protocols. Her mission had grown, and ironically, it all started because a judge chose not to listen. But there was still one last question, the one that lingers when a story like this ends. In the final scene of the hearing, what remained was silence, but not the silence of oppression, rather, the silence of reflection. The video made waves in the digital and legal worlds, and the question that began to echo among judges, students, and everyday citizens was simple and devastating. How many voices like Ashley's have been silenced without a chance to speak? And the answer, painful as it is, lies in the hallways of justice. Many. And these stories must finally be told. Ashley set a precedent that no code could contain. Her gesture became an example. Her courage became a case study. And her presence, a constant reminder that not every judge is ready to truly listen. With every lecture, every live event, she challenged the system, not with rage, but with intelligence, empathy, and preparation. And more importantly, with results. Because the stories that truly change the world are the ones no one dares to ignore. And if you think all of this was exaggerated or staged, ask yourself this. What would have happened if Ashley hadn't been who she was? She would have been humiliated and forgotten like so many others. But she resisted. She rewrote the script. And she taught us that justice is only just when it truly listens. Now the question is, are you ready to listen to what comes next? So tell me, how many times have you ignored someone just because of how they dressed or spoke? How many stories have you missed because in a split second you decided that person wasn't worth your time? The truth is harsh, but it must be told. All of us, at some point, have been too quick to judge and too slow to listen. And that's why Ashley's case is more than a courtroom account of prejudice. It's a mirror. One of those mirrors that doesn't just reflect your face, it reflects your soul. It reveals our flaws, our biased ways of seeing, our misplaced urgency. Ashley didn't want pity. She wanted to be heard. She wanted her voice to carry the same weight as any well-dressed defendant. But there, before Judge Emily, all she received was contempt. The judge didn't even need to speak. Her gaze was enough. Enough to make clear that, to her, Ashley was just another one. Another young black woman, likely with a troubled past, with arguments she found predictable, with a speech she dismissed as hollow. The problem is, Emily forgot one crucial detail. Some stories cannot be silenced, no matter how hard they try. They find a gap, a pause, a moment of truth, and that's exactly what happened there. Ashley took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and began to speak. Not with anger, not with desperation, but with the serenity of someone who carries an ancestral strength, the strength of generations who were silenced but still endured. She spoke of rights. She spoke of the Constitution. She spoke of the legitimacy of protest. And above all, she spoke of the value of listening. The courtroom, until then restless, fell silent. A silence that wasn't empty. It was the silence of shame, of reflection, of a change beginning to take root. Judge Emily tried to maintain her composure, tried to regain control. But the more Ashley spoke, the more that courtroom turned into a stage for revelations. Because those words weren't improvised. They came from someone who had studied, someone who had prepared, someone who knew the system from the inside. And when one of the attorneys stood up and said, "Your Honor, allow me to introduce Dr. Ashley Ribeiro, award-winning researcher in human rights and advisor to the International Council of Justice," everything changed. The reactions were immediate. Interns widened their eyes, prosecutors exchanged silent glances, and the judge lowered her head like someone who realizes, too late, that she was wrong. Because some stories are like earthquakes. They shake structures that once seemed solid. They expose cracks no one wanted to see. And they demand change. Change in posture, in mindset, in humanity. But this story doesn't end there. Because the most important part isn't the judge's shame or Ashley's revelation. The most important part is what happens afterward. What happens to those who witnessed it all, who saw prejudice unfold live, who felt the impact of truth spoken with courage? What do you do after seeing that? Do you forget? Do you go on like nothing happened? Or do you choose to change? And that's where the hardest part begins. Because listening to a story is easy. What's hard is letting it change your actions, letting it re-educate your perspective, letting it break your habits of judgment, letting it help you truly see people, without the filters the world has taught, without the labels society imposes. What's hard is recognizing that behind every appearance lies a journey, and every journey is a universe. If you've made it this far, it's because this story moved you. Maybe you saw yourself in it. Maybe it reminded you of someone who was once dismissed, or maybe you yourself have been judged like that, by your clothes, your voice, your background, your surname. Whatever the reason, the truth is, you felt something. And feeling is the first step. The second is action. So how about turning that feeling into action? Start by listening more. Start by questioning your impulses. Start by asking yourself every time you meet someone different from you, do I really know who this person is? And more importantly, am I willing to find out? Because it's only when we choose to learn the stories that don't fit the mold that we begin to build a fairer world. We live in a time ruled by speed, where judgment is instant, where appearance has become a kind of argument. But there is something stronger than all of that. Truth. And truth, when told by someone who's lived exclusion firsthand, has a power that no diploma, no title, no position can erase. Ashley showed that, not just to Emily, but to everyone in that courtroom. And now, to you too. So, if this story touched you, don't let it stay trapped inside a screen. Take it into your conversations. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Teach your children, your coworkers, your neighbors. And remember, change doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins in our minds, in our hearts, and in our behavior. And if you want to keep learning from stories that challenge assumptions, confront broken systems, and truly inspire transformation, then subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. Here, we don't just tell stories to stir emotions. We tell them to awaken, to disrupt, to make people think, and most of all, to help you build a more attentive, fair, and human perspective. Are you ready for the next one? Because the next story might be yours.